Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Uncanny Annie. Evidently, this is from the Into the Darkness series, which ultimately means it was plucked from that and made to be its own film. So, really, the only thing that I was in the dark about was the backstory of these characters. It kind of seems like the story and our lines of everything kind of feels very clunky or reasonably. Of course, for every single one of these kind of board game or just kind of game like movies, you never really get to know anything much about the characters until it's probably too late. To where the point is of you not even giving a crap. You don't even care. Like, you can't invest in these characters until they basically die, and then justifiably, why do you need to invest in that now? I thought that there was some potential to this movie that when watching this was like, you know what, this movie could actually be something. It just needs a heck of a lot better story. Like, there are so many lines in this movie where I was just like, God, this is like, could I just watch this movie on mute until we actually get to the board game part, and then I'll watch till that point? Because any of the backstory doesn't actually matter, as well as any other board game movie that you've ever seen, like Brittany Snow's Would You Rather, or The Midnight Man with Robert England, or Truth or Dare, all of those ones that ultimately weren't exactly all that great, but they tried. Clue. Clue is actually a great movie. Actually, there was much backstory to much of those characters. Eventually, we had to kind of figure out the backstory as we went along with that movie, so that's different. Jumanji, we only knew backstory really about Robert Williams' character. That's about it, and eventually we kind of got there, I guess, at some point. But anyways, speaking of Jumanji, this movie has to remind you that Jumanji exists. Like, basically, they were putting a board game movie together because I guess Jumanji was successful. It's kind of a weird thing to approach in this movie. But, anyways, like, I think in the trailer and in the movie, they have to remind you that Jumanji exists. Hey, guys, this is probably just like Jumanji, right? Yeah. High five. High five. But still, Into the Darkness, like, hey, was there any backstory to any of these characters? No. Will there be one? It won't matter. Okay, well, alright, well, see you later. It's just. Anyways, so going into this, it's a Halloween party that you can't really tell is exactly a Halloween party. The costumes are kind of overly generic, and to the point of you not even really understanding that it is a Halloween party, because we have one character that just has a Santa hat and just has a white shirt and gray sweatpants, and ultimately on this white shirt it just says Satan Claus. Okay. I guess this is a Halloween party, I guess. They had to kind of scrape the bottom of the barrel to kind of get costumes on these people, but I guess good enough, right? Anyways, so we also had to have like a cheerleading outfit that just says the word cheer on it, for the girl. I'm like, yeah, because ultimately you could barely tell that that's really a cheerleading outfit. For most, it could be baseball, but who knows? Anyways, I thought that there was some potential in this movie. I thought once we actually get to the board game part, I thought that part was actually like an interesting thing going on into here. But anyways, let's go into uh, here's the thing that always kind of bothers me about these board game films, or just any game that ultimately is done. So when hearing of this board game that ultimately they come up with for this movie, it's like, has anyone ever heard of this board game? No. Does it look like it has any official labels of any kind via this board game? No. Does it look like does this look like a household thing that everyone has played in their life? No. Well, why play the board game? Why not just go like, hey, how about we just play Parcheesi or Yahtzee or some official game that everyone has played in their life? Because when looking at it, I don't know, this moment of this picking of this board game kind of felt to me like in the movie Cabin in the Woods, where everybody goes down to the basement and ultimately they have to choose their form of destructor. To ultimately, we have this girl who's picking up a book and like, yeah, this book is interesting to read. Hopefully, it doesn't kill me, but maybe it probably will. Out of these hundreds and hundreds of things that it could have almost killed me at some point by us picking certain things out. Wasn't that fun? So going into this, yeah, we have it to where like there's one board game that has to like stick out, so that's the one they have to play. Reasonably, this party, man, do these people quickly seemingly get like bored at this party to where it goes from like as soon as everybody gets there, it's like, yeah, we have nothing to do. We can't even get drunk like we want to because this movie doesn't have a budget. So we can't drink, we can't listen to music because we can't pay for any kind of music for this movie. So we can't pretend that we're partying. So what are we going to do? Let's just play a board game because some person from the grave suggested it, from the beyond suggested us to play a board game. And so that's what we have to do. Because there is backstory of dead person, which ultimately makes us want to play a board game because of nostalgia of dead person that ultimately is pushing us to want to play a game that ultimately is going to lead to our deaths as well. So, going into this, yeah, there is one lick of backstory. I guess you can ultimately say that there is quasi a way of kind of investing in some of the characters when eventually they get into the early stages of this game. I am going to kind of plop around through this portion of board game. I'm probably not going to go through every single little thing that they do, but I'm going to try to because I probably won't remember every single little silly thing that they do. But anyways, let's ultimately go into the sweet and delicious double fived spoiler time. Of course, first doing it in a very cryptic like sense, but then let's go into that sweet, sweet double five to otherwise go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's probably about that time to, go into a thing and ultimately try to spoil it and ultimately tell everybody what's going on. Hey, buddy. Right there? All right. Spoiler time. So, spoilers. So, we have it to where in the beginning of this movie, everybody's going to a Halloween party that's going to bore the crap out of them to death. And so, we have people that are ultimately at first, we have guys that are always playing Dungeons and Dragons. I'm like, okay, I can get into this movie. Like, okay, like, maybe this is going to turn into an interesting variation of Dungeons and Dragons, and then ultimately it'll just be like the weirdest thing that you've ever seen in your life. But no, we ultimately have it to where these guys are playing Dungeons and Dragons. I'm like, yes, let's D&D our way to this game, delish. But then ultimately we have it to where the guys just start playing it, and then one person just drops the whole entire board game, and of course does it on purpose so that way they can transition into the next scene, to where they're not spending way too much time on playing D&D. And ultimately we have it to where the people are kind of like, they're angry because, like, dude, we spent so much time playing D&D. Like, it took us hours to play this. Sure it did. putting pieces wherever on this board and ultimately just saying, yes, we spent hours playing this game. You never spent 1 minute playing the game. You probably don't even know how to play it. So, pushing on. So, we have it to where Satan Claus, because Satan Claus with basically just a white shirt that says so, and a Santa hat, and the ability just to not ever really say ho 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 at some point. So we ultimately have this jerk named Michael who is Satan Claus, and he is talking about the guys, and he's kind of like just kind of being a dick, of course, because really he's the D of this movie. So, as well as just kind of like mocking a lot of people, or ultimately just, he's trying to be nice, but when looking at it, like, yeah, he's got to give some people some crap. So, we have it to where girls are coming to this party, actually. I'm like, huzzah, that's great. And so, ultimately, we go into one board game just to play yet another board game. I'm like, guys, you went from doing D&D to now having to find another board game to play. You couldn't have come up with just another random story of a D&D thing and just like, hey, go at it. But I guess reasonably nobody wanted to create a D&D character or whatever. Nobody wanted to take that time. Anyways, mood point. So we ultimately have it to where the girls are ultimately getting girls. When I say girls, I mean Eve and Wendy are getting drinks because ultimately they really need to get frickin' just drunk before they do anything else at this party, which isn't even a party. And so all while that is going on, we have Grace who is getting to know some of the guys, and ultimately the guys are evidently reminiscing about a friend of theirs. Ultimately, I believe his name is Tony. I could be wrong about this. So ultimately we have Craig and Michael ultimately reminiscing about Tony on how he loved Halloween and how ultimately he loved to play board games because you gotta sucker us in to try to figure out how to have board games being put into this movie somehow. So yeah, let's have the dead person make us forcibly do a board game. Because he's from the beyond of the grave telling us, yeah, play this board game. It's going to be fun. You're going to die, but meh. Apples and oranges. So we have it to where ultimately they have to tell us the backstory of why this person is dead. Because ultimately he had drowned in like 6 inches of water. And ultimately Grace is asking, can you seriously drown from 6 inches of water? And ultimately Michael is saying, yes, you can die from 6 inches of water. Believe me, we Googled it, we Wikipedia'd it, we did a calculator and crunched the numbers, and surefire enough, you can drown from 6 inches of water. Guaranteed. So yeah, we ultimately find out that Tony died from drowning from 6 inches of water, and what a way to go. But we have to tell that backstory eventually of how exactly this man did unfortunately die. Through flashback, which eventually happens later on in this movie. So we ultimately have it to where Wendy's like, you know what? How about we play a board game? Because evidently everybody is saying the word board game consistently. So how about Wendy's like, how about I go and get a board game? Because this party has gone from a 1 to a 7 when hearing the word board game. Man, this party is off the hook. So Wendy goes and finds a room that is really dark and ultimately tries to get all these board games, and she just plops them all down. Surefire enough, the one Uncanny Annie board game is the thickest board game out of all of these other ones. I'm like, what? You couldn't have gotten an even board game like thing that looks just like all the other ones? Come on. Like, you basically had to forcibly get the one that stuck out the most for these board games. So ultimately they're kind of picking through all these board games, and ultimately Wendy's like, hey, look at this Uncanny Annie game. Like, well, it's Halloween, and I guess it fits the theme, right? Look at the cover of this board game. Like, look at the box of it. Like, oh my god, look at the artistry. Look at the absolutely no unofficial labels whatsoever on this entire board game whatsoever, as well as me thinking back to the very beginning of this game, which made absolutely a game. When looking back at this, thinking back of this early portion of this movie, where we have some guy just running around in the darkness, and we have Annie chasing after him. I'm like, okay, that scene made no sense. Just like again, the labels of which that have no box, no official labels on box or nothing, like no barcode, no nothing. But they're just like, heck yeah, we gotta play this game because it's weird looking. So everybody's just like, yeah, I hope this weird and interesting board game won't lead to us all dying. Huh? Huh? High five. So we have it to where ultimately we find out while they're putting this board game out that there is two different sets of cards, and ultimately if they pick one card and they're like, no, I don't want to do said card, ultimately they can throw the card away and ultimately pick up another of the other end and just go, I think I'll do this one. And so reasonably we have it to where there seems to be this weird black box that is also like within this game, that it's like, okay, this black box doesn't make much of sense, but okay, sure. So we find out that these people, when they win a challenge that ultimately this game provides, they get a little thing that ultimately has it to where little piece that ultimately has at the end of the day has to forcibly spell out Annie. So every time they win something, they'll get this piece that has like A and then N and I E, and so ultimately Michael's like, "Hey guys, there's so much of us, we should be able to finish this game in no time, right? Huh? Huh? It probably won't lead to our horrific deaths, I'm sure." Sure, Michael. Sure. So we push on, and so I'm not going to go through every single level of this thing, but like we first have to start out with Wendy ultimately going into a bathroom, not doing number one or number two. She's ultimately just having to look at a mirror and ultimately doing this rhyming scenario, because the game will ultimately tell you that ultimately it has some rhyming scenario about Annie and ultimately how uh, ultimately that eventually she's gonna come to get you and blah 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 and all this nonsense. And so reasonably uh, we have it to where Wendy goes into a darkened room and ultimately has to say the words Uncanny Annie 3 times, and that ultimately is to, I guess, unleash the Annie, I guess. And so what ends up happening when Wendy ultimately does these things and ultimately turns on the light, we have it to where the mirror ultimately says, "Thank you for picking my game, Wendy." And so we have it to where Wendy freaks out and she's like, "Oh my god, somebody must have just, before they knew exactly I was going to be able to go in the bathroom, somebody like fogged up this entire mirror and told me that, like, thank you for playing my game, Wendy. Like, did you guys plan this? Did you guys did you?" And ultimately we have Michael that's like, "Dude, I think you were seeing things. Like, I think you were I think you were doing a number two in there, and maybe you pulled too hard. Like, let's go in there and see what the heck you're talking about." So Michael and Wendy go in there, and ultimately there is no foghorn fog screen thing on the window, or window on the mirror that says, "Thank you for playing my game, Wendy." And so ultimately Michael's like, Like, are you sure you're not drunk? Like, are you sure you're not hallucinating? Are you sure you're not a little crazy? And so ultimately, we also have a turn that eventually Grace takes, where supposedly she has to pick somebody, and she picks Peter. Here's the thing, though. We bizarrely have it to where Grace is ultimately seeing some kind of envision. She's seeing some kind of visions of sorts. Ultimately, her eyes are at some points in this movie becoming white, and you're all of a sudden seeing a flash of something. I'm like, why is it that she didn't prevent any of this? Or why is it that she isn't saying anything about any of this to ultimately it will prevent any of these deaths? Because if she is fortune-seeking seer person, why couldn't she have prevented any of these things? I guess, bizarrely, the movie is going to tell us that something is coming to put us on edge, but ultimately it's not going to really tie all that much into the movie. I don't know, they just wanted to freak us out because evidently there was nothing much going on in this game. So they kind of wanted these little flashes of things to get us like anticipated for eventually someone to, I guess, die at some point. So going on into here, we have it to where the game is going on. We ultimately have to learn every single fear of every single person. I think there's some kind of fears that ultimately I didn't really care about. I didn't care about much of the fears and much of the girls' ones. I think Mike was ultimately, his fear was that ultimately he was afraid of driving at night. And like I think Peter had some stupid fear, like eventually dying or something like that, or some flimsy like fear. And ultimately Michael called him out on it, and he's like, well, hey, like, you just driving at night, that's not really a good enough fear. I wish somebody would have said bears. I have a fear of Batman. That's my fear. That guy is creepy. So we have it to where this game is ultimately not getting interesting enough. So let's get into the more interesting parts. So we ultimately have it to where Peter ultimately he grabs a card, and ultimately we find out that it seems that it's stabbed or be stabbed. Like stab or be stabbed. So we ultimately find out that there is a Reaper lurking into this house that ultimately has to stab Peter, or Peter has to stab Reaper. So we have it to where there's this like clunking sound, ultimately me thinking that it could quite possibly be Satan Claus, or some other thing that could arose with such a clatter that ultimately everybody has to go and look of what's the matter. So everybody rises up and goes looking and lurking through the house to ultimately see what the heck that sound was. Because if anything were to tell you in every other horror movie that you've ever seen in your life, if there's a sound going on in your home, you're just like, dude, I'm not moving from where I'm at. Like, no. Like, house, if a pipe is going to break, if all of a sudden half of this house just rips into half, I don't care. This is horror movie going on right now. I'm not going to move from my spot. Like, if anybody, I'm going to super glue myself to my spot until ultimately something horribly goes awry to where I have to regret super gluing myself from this spot. But when that day comes, I'm waiting. So we have them looking throughout the entire house, and ultimately it seems that this Reaper is kind of like, he's kind of glitching from place to place, but ultimately they end up walking into this hallway where ultimately the Reaper is, and this Reaper is this kind of very goofy looking special effect of sorts, but we have it to where ultimately we have Peter that is ultimately trying to he's like, you know what, F this, I'm going to fight this Reaper guy. And so he goes and he fights it, and ultimately you have to have one of the other girls ultimately tell him, it's like, hey, Peter, you have to do exactly what was on the card to tell everybody what you're going to do next. You have to either stab the Reaper or the Reaper is going to stab you. So make sure you're going to stab the Reaper with any kind of thing that's on you. You know, like a bobby pin or a So and ultimately have Peter stab this Reaper, and ultimately there is a successful level of which they can notch on their Annie card and or Annie name and keep on going. So we have it to where here we have another challenge that ultimately Craig is being a part of. So our challenge is ultimately to have Craig hold on to this card while everything around him is going completely haywire. And to also, there is some old, ugly looking man that is ultimately just going to be popping in, just like, hey, I'm old and I'm ugly. Look at me. Look at me, I'm old and ugly. So while Craig is ultimately like looking at his card, he's reading it. Ultimately, he puts the card back onto the board, and we ultimately find out that the card will not move from the board, but Craig has to hold on to the card, and so we have it to where Craig is ultimately trying to desperately put his hands, both of his hands, on this card to keep the card from moving, but he also cannot look at the Oogie Boogie Man, so he has to close his eyes. We also find out that there is some seemingly poltergeist-esque like things going on, where it seems like there is a bunch of stuff that it just starts to bizarrely start to move all over the place, because you have to have a ghost thing going on in a horror movie. So we ultimately have we start having like knives starting to move, or like drills starting to move, or we have just all kinds of craziness all start to move throughout this entire house, and everybody's just like, man, this kind of just sucks, doesn't it, everybody? Yeah, high five. So we ultimately have it to where Craig ultimately is just like he's desperately trying to close his eyes, but ultimately he then finally opens his eyes to see old man, ugly man, going boo, and Craig is like, "Oh my God, I'm scared because I am." And ultimately, the old man takes the card, and ultimately they lose that round. So moving on, we ultimately have it to where Eve ultimately gets a card that ultimately says, "Hey, you're going to have to tell the truth." Uh, and so ultimately we have it to where, and there's a part that I forgot about here, and I'll talk about that in a second. So we ultimately have it to where Eve tells her truth, and ultimately the people counted that as her dirty secret truth esh like thing. Eventually, in this movie, earlier on, they end up going outside their home. Told me just like, dude, this is all kinds of crazy. I think I'm going to leave. After that whole Reaper situation, they decide to try to leave the house. And they realize that they can't leave the house because everything surrounding this house is utter blackness. It seems like they walk away from the house, and whatever is around this house is like solid to where they can walk on it. We ultimately have it to where Peter walks a little bit too far, and ultimately he gets killed for his troubles. And Grace is ultimately watching Peter die right in front of her, and leaving them just go like, well, I guess we're just gonna, I guess we're just gonna stay in this home because what else are we gonna do? There's nowhere to go if we try to get out of here. So, leaving us now to get to Michael. So we ultimately have one person dead now, and so now we are ultimately getting to Michael. And we have it seemingly where we are pretty much close to winning this game. We are like one letter away, and huzzah, high five, Jumanji, yeah, we're gonna win, right? So, because Jumanji is a thing stapled in this movie. So, you ultimately have Michael who's like, well, I wonder what my card is going to be. I wonder what my card's going to be. Probably the easiest thing in my life. And so recently we have Michael who picks up his card and he reads it and he's like, dude, this is the exact same card that was given to Eve. like, it's a truth card. I have to tell my deepest, darkest, delicious, succulent secret, and I don't know if I can do that. And so immediately I'm thinking, like, oh, well, Michael probably cheated on Wendy with Eve or something like that. Like, I'm assuming that's what happened. Huh? And what actually happened was something even much more different than that. So, as I would say before, there was a flashback that ultimately we are going to see here that alludes to someone's death. So, you ultimately have it to where Michael is just absurdly just going, I'm not going to reveal my deepest, darkest, succulent, deliciously horrific secret. No matter what, I'm not going to tell my secret. My Ryan Seacrest, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to reveal my secret to anybody. And Wendy ultimately is like trying to tell Michael, whatever your secret is, we'll all forgive you. It doesn't matter what the secret is. Just say whatever it is. Say it out loud. Say it to the cows. Say it to the goat. That ultimately is not here right now, but dang, I wish it was, because that would have been hilarious. Say it to anybody. And so Michael's like, no, I absurdly will not tell this secret. So we end up pushing on for Michael to be into the utter darkness, the blackness. And because ultimately we have it to where Michael is trying to get back to the house, because ultimately he can see it from the distance. So he's trying to walk closer to the house, but the house just gets further and further and further. And so ultimately they're like, oh my God, they took Michael, the one guy that ultimately had the shirt, the white shirt that said onto his chest, Satan Claus. Man, this sucks. So we ultimately have it to where Michael is ultimately just like going like, well, I guess I'm gonna die probably pretty soon, Brad. You think, Game? You think, Annie? Are you out there? So we have it to where Michael is ultimately seeing a car off to the distance, and it's a very familiar car to him, and it's a very familiar rainy night, evidently, that this turns into. So we ultimately have Michael in flashback form. Uh, we have Michael that is watching a Michael from the past. And so this Michael is talking to Tony. Ultimately, Tony and Michael get out of the car. It seems that Michael's only thing was to get with Eve. And ultimately, I believe Wendy and Eve could have quite possibly had some affair of sorts going on, or I think Tony might have ended up with one of the girls, or maybe like Tony was like a sister to Wendy, I think. I don't know how exactly that relationship was, but we ultimately have it to where Tony and Michael are fighting, and ultimately that is to lead to Michael shoving Tony, and so ultimately Michael just thinks it's like, well, you know what? How about you just walk home? Like, yeah, like you're being a piece of garbage, and I just want to bang Eve. That's all I'm thinking about. So how about you just go and walk home, and you just kind of work off your alcohol. So you ultimately have it to where we find out that Eve's in the back seat, and she's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" It's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And Michael's just like, "Dude, he's drunk and I'm drunk, so let's go home." So I can get my banging done. I can get some of that banging of Eve done. So ultimately, Michael and Eve drive off, and Michael ultimately is just kind of walking and stupidly, whatever, walking through this street to ultimately fall into some puddle. To ultimately, he drowns himself, and ultimately, we have current time Michael ultimately running to Tony and grabbing him out of this little pond of sorts, a little gap of sorts, and we have it to where Michael is ultimately saying, "I'm sorry that I killed you, and I'm sorry that we were drunk, and I was stupid, and everyone was stupid, and so were you." So we ultimately have it to where Tony wakes up and grabs Michael and pushes him into the little water gap, little water hole, to where ultimately it ends up that Michael ends up drowning and dying viciously. So reasonably, we are to end up repetitiously at some point having to mourn everyone's losses, but I think Michael like really struck everybody even more so than anything else. But immediately everyone was thinking if they could just beat the game, that ultimately every single one of their friends could be saved. And I'm like, that's no. I don't think that ever happens in any number of these games. Like if you win the game, like it's gonna be just all fine and dandy. That never happens. So going on into this, we ultimately have it to where we have people playing some rounds and stuff like that, but it eventually gets to the turn of them having to now forcibly do uh, this game called hide and seek. But let's do a head count. So we have Wendy, Eve, Grace, and Craig left because the two other guys had died. And so we have it to where they're forcibly having to do this hide and seek thing. And so reasonably, we have yet another Reaper that is going to have to try and find these people. And so reasonably, this Reaper is ultimately going to have a time limit to find these people or find everybody. And so the Reaper is going around the house and he sucks at finding people. And ultimately, he ends up going into uh, some room of sorts, and it seems like one of the players, I believe it's Wendy, ends up locking the room that the Reaper is in, to where the Reaper is ultimately just like, hey, like, what's going on? Because ultimately the Reaper ends up going beyond his time limit and ultimately breaks the phone that ultimately has his time limit and so on and so forth. So they ultimately end up trying to like hold back this Reaper through this door. And so we have a tour. One of the girls ultimately, Craig and one of the girls trade places, and Craig is holding the door. And so ultimately, the girls are trying to ask him, it's like, well, what do you think we should do? Like, how do you think we should beat the game? Like, ultimately, now we put all the letters on the board. What should we do? And Craig's like, I don't know. Like, all everyone touch the table. Like, all you girls all touch the table, and ultimately, just like I think that could be it. And so all of a sudden they all touch the board with the exclusion of Greg because he can't. And so ultimately all of a sudden everything goes absurdly quiet. And they're just like, okay, well, maybe that was it. Maybe we did it. Maybe we won. And then all of a sudden you just see Craig ultimately bleeding from his eyes because ultimately he gets a stab through the door, ultimately killing him. To ultimately we have it to where uh, the girls eventually just run off. So we eventually have it to where this Reaper eventually goes away, and ultimately they end up having to play another round. So there, of course, is only the three girls left. Of course, Eve, who has cheer across her chest, and we have Wendy, who is a punk rocker vampire, and we have Prom Night Girl, who ultimately has lost her slash at this point. So we are ultimately led to have it be, of course, these people's turn. Ultimately, at some point, we have Grace's turn. And I'm like, this has gotta be the most stupidest turn that I've ever heard of in my life. So reasonably, Grace ends up having almost the exact same similar turn as Craig did. So reasonably, what happens is Grace has to hold on to her card and not make one single iota of a sound. And Old Man Ugly Man is going to come back again and ultimately just like try and make her make a sound of sorts. To where all this guy has to do is have one really ugly fingernail to ultimately just go like really close to this girl's eye. Like, yeah, I'm coming for you. I'm coming. That is what this old guy does. He just has a weird looking fingernail that is ultimately just getting closer and closer to this girl's eye. To where eventually she blinks with her eye, and the blink makes a sound. Wait a minute. Let's do this again. So this girl's blinking of her eye makes a sound. Troll to me, the old man's like, good enough. Kill, and slices her throat, and she dies. And it's like, well, yeah, you guys didn't win this round, I guess. Sucks to be you. So they ultimately have to play one more round. But when we had the three girls, at some point they gave them a little, they gave them a morning time, like a morning card that ultimately says, hey guys, you need time to mourn. Even though your life is on the line, how about you guys take some time to mourn? And here's a card for that. I thought that was stupid. So they're like, yeah, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to have to mourn. Wouldn't you know it? We're going to have to mourn. So I thought that was so stupid. But then we ultimately have Grace, who's ultimately dying. And I'm like, dude, there's only two people left. I'm assuming every single person is going to die at this point. I'm like, dude, you have Cheerleader and you have Wendy. I'm like, come on. Like, I'm thinking everyone's going to die at this point. So we ultimately have it to where Eve and Wendy are the only two that are left. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course you have to have it be like to where it's like there's only females that are left, because any horror movie will tell you that it always has to be a female at the end, which I'm completely fine with. So we have it to where this last challenge, because there's only so many people left, we ultimately finally have Annie, who pops up and is ultimately going to have this like lightning round, I guess, of this game of sorts. And to where ultimately Wendy picks the card that ultimately unleashes Annie. And so we have it to where Annie comes in and she's like, oh, okay, well, you guys have to wager something. And ultimately Wendy's like, well, I'll wager my own life. And I'll wager my own life if we can all be free of this game. And I mean all of my friends. Like, all my friends need to all be back alive, and we all need to be all fine and free and everything like that. And so Annie's just like, oh, okay, well, like, I'll let all your friends go free, but I won't wager your life, Wendy. I want to wager the life of Eve instead. And so ultimately we have it to where Eve is like, no, like, or Wendy's like, no, I want to wager my own life. Like, it's fair. I don't want to wager the life of my friend. And so Eve ultimately has to tell the backstory of Tony dying to Wendy. So we have to hear this backstory, like, I think 2 or 3 times now, of this whole thing going on, and we have to flashback it again to ultimately tell us the thing that we already seen in a portion of this movie already. But to show us even better that Eve was actually there, which they could have done that any time of earlier, but they have to let us remind us that she was there in that scenario. So Eve ultimately is willing, surefire enough, to be able to put her life on the line because Tony has some significance to Wendy, and to ultimately she's like, heck yeah, like, if anything, yeah, I'm just gonna let, like, sure, Eve put her life on the line. So we have this whole thing to be determined by a roll of the dice. If it goes upon a Reaper, then Wendy and Eve are to die. But if it goes on to a face of Annie, then ultimately they all go free. And I'm like, dude, if this is a roll of the dice, there is no way that this is going to turn in their favor. There is no way. This dice has to be rigged or something along those lines. So, surefire enough, we have the dice rolled, and surefire enough, they are to die. And so, reasonably, we have it to where ultimately Wendy has to kill Eve. And so, at first, Wendy is going to put a drill to Eve's head, but then decides not to. And we have it to where Annie is taking control of Wendy and Eve, to ultimately where Annie ends up killing Eve. So we have it to where Wendy ultimately decides, like, hey, you know what? Because ultimately we found out that in this movie that the key to this whole thing is this black box that is in this board game. We find out that every single person and this entire home had all been sucked into this black box. And so we have it to where Wendy takes this drill and ultimately into the black box. So ultimately we are supposed to believe that this black box is the key to Annie's power, and ultimately is to quite possibly kill her with drilling this hole into this black box. And Annie's like, oh my god, I'm feeling so weak. Oh, I'm melting. Oh, this is so horrible. And so we have it to where Wendy is drilling into this thing, and then ultimately she supposedly kills Annie. And so Wendy all of a sudden absurdly is like, did we win? Huh? And then ultimately Wendy arrives back at the house. It seems like the game had just been started, or the game had just been set out, and ultimately Wendy is looking all around the house and like ultimately asking like, hey, like, is anybody here? Is everyone still alive? Did we win? Is it all copacetic? Am I going to possibly die for any reasons because I'm probably to be thinking that everything is completely okay and something's going to happen? Because if I've ever seen any horror movie in my life, there has to be a level of uncertainty that's going to happen at every ending of every movie that I've ever seen in my life. So, but Wendy is ultimately just like, you know what? I'm gonna go and sit in my chair, and like, I think I've won. I think I've beaten everything, or like, you know what? I think I'm fine. Like, I think everything's okay. So Wendy goes and sits in her chair because she's freaking tired, and we ultimately have it to where Annie ultimately pops right behind Wendy, which I'm like, yeah, of course that's what they do. And Annie ends up killing Wendy off camera, to where all you can see is just kind of uh, the the place of which they are at. And then eventually we also get to have these like little like bizarre little flashes of Annie to try and do one last little scare of sorts, but it didn't really work on me. And then we roll credits. Yeah, interesting. Like, yeah, an interesting movie. But yeah, there was a lot of like where I was just kind of like, man, like every single time doing this movie this way kind of makes the characters like really dumb. A lot of the characters just looked really dumb in this movie, and I felt so sorry for all the characters, all the actors. I'm like, man, like horror movies tend to make people look very, very dumb. And that's the horrible thing about horror movies is I wish that instead of like making these characters look dumb, it would be a consistently outsmarting maneuver that consistently happens within these horror movies. But instead, it's like, oh, somebody's gonna slip on a banana peel and die from that. Oh, what a horrific moment that is. And that's what always happens through every single one of these kinds of things: is slipping on a banana peel and someone dies. That's what always happens in these stupid kind of horror films, where they always have to make the people, of course, have to forcibly die because they're morons most of the time. But anyways, other than that, I'm going to get out of here. I thought that this movie was just okay. It was like I was really just going into here, just ultimately just kind of thinking of just it being like, hey, cool, another board game movie. All right, this could be god awful, or it could just be just kind of just okay. So my expectations were kind of really low, and I think it kind of met those expectations. So I guess it couldn't be too harsh on this. Just to say it's an okay film, and that's all it needs to be. So I'm gonna okay my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.